Okay, seeing none, we're going to move to Chief Financial Officer reports, and we're going to start with PMA presentation. Howie, you want to step up? Are we set up for Howie with his PowerPoint?
Yes.
And if we want to turn the light down a little bit, would it help, or I don't know, for the people to look at?
Good evening, everybody. It's nice to see some familiar faces. I'd like to present this evening the projections as we have them, looking forward the next 5 years with some historical background. If we could go to that slide, thank you. We do have the audits from the last 5 years included with one adjustment, which I'll get to in just a second, which is reporting on cash balances from FY12 forward. That allows us to have comparing apples to apples with prior years, as well as one of the things that occurred in FY12 was that because the county got onto its supposedly normal cycle of distributing dollars from that tax distribution in August, the auditors accrued that money back to the prior year. The last couple of years that's occurred, but to try to equalize that to prior years, we've simply looked at the cash balances. The FY14 budget, in each year that we present the projections, we're going off of the approved budget for that current year as the basis for the projections moving forward. So that is where we're at. We're looking at the levy, the extension, everything that goes into the tax rates and distribution, the equalized assessed valuation, and there are some changes from what we had thought would occur over the last year or so. Enrollment and staffing compensation. I'd just note on the compensation that looking back over conversations with the board, with the finance group, with Dr. Skinkus, with Tim, the salary schedule that was in place prior to this contract was one that we jointly identified as having some significant issues and really not being sustainable over a long period of time because of the cost of the step increases. My review of the current contract is that you have gone very, very far in correcting that, changing that. I don't know if correcting is the appropriate word, but certainly in changing that to a salary schedule that is far more sustainable over a period of time under the tax cap than what you had. And then, of course, the district assumptions that we put together working with the administration and the finance committee. Next one, please. I think we've really touched on this, negating that possibility of late tax distributions. The 14 budgets, you do have a projected surplus this year. In the operating funds, the 93% of your revenue from local sources. So really the predominant issues here and the assumptions that are most critical on the revenue side are those that impact local property taxes. You're in the first year of a 3-year contract, and salaries and benefits making up 75% of that operating budget. And that graph then simply looks at that, breaks it down a little further. 3.9% of your revenues from general state aid, and another 3.3% for categorical payments. I would notice when we look backwards at 2013, you may know that you got that, I'm sure you do, that you had a 5th categorical payment that you received in FY13 that nobody knew was coming until the couple of days before it showed up in bank accounts. What occurred, and then subsequently assisted with changing the projections for this year, back in the sequestration and the arguments in Washington in 2012 about what would occur with tax rates, left particularly capital gains taxes going up significantly on January 1st of 2013. So there was for people with extraordinary capital gains exposure, many people accelerated that income into 2012 which at the state level resulted in about $1.5 billion of money that the state did not anticipate in putting together the FY13 budget. And the Department of Revenue calls that their April surprise. They used part of that money, a significant portion, to make that extra categorical payment, and then they used part of that money to subsidize this year's general state aid so that it remained at the 89% proration that we had last year. Next, please. The local, please.
You use terms like 89% proration.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean, so people understand?
Sure. That the general state aid formula looks at the wealth of the district and using property values, EAV, as the major marker for the property wealth of the district divided by the average daily attendance. That's essentially where it derives the majority of the general state aid formula. The state then calculates how much under that formula each district is entitled to, and then because it was the appropriation for last year, and actually for the last 3 years, did not fully meet that obligation, the state board has to reduce the amount that it gave to every district, and it did so by distributing 89% to each district of the money to which the formula would have entitled them. We are looking at a couple of things on the levy. We knew that the 1.7 consumer price index would drive your levy that you adopted in December, and we now know that 1.5% CPI will drive next year's extension. It's considerably lower than what we had anticipated, and because of that, we've also reduced the assumptions on what consumer price index would be in future years. I would note, trying to add some sensitivity analysis, if you will, to this, that a 1% increase in the consumer price index generates about $185,000 of additional tax dollars to which you have access. Existing EAV, we were projecting it to follow a pattern of no change for this year, no change for next year, and then an increase. You'll remember that last year we had some significantly different numbers for what we expected with the assessment when they were to come out last March, or last August it actually came out. And instead of seeing flat to a slight gain, we saw a tremendous drop in the existing EAV in the district of about 8.5%. Under the tax cap, the implications of that are several. First, the cap doesn't change the dollars that you have access to, but because EAV dropped, your tax rate to access those dollars would go up. That in and of itself doesn't generate any additional dollars. It's only controlled by the CPI. However, because the rate went up, new property generated a few more dollars than what we would have anticipated a year ago. So this year, new property estimated at $2 million a year. $1 million generates, with your current tax rate, about $22,500. And we used a tax collection rate. If you remember, we had conversation, I think 2 or 3 years ago, I think 2, about how to model tax refunds, tax appeals at PTAB, the Property Tax Appeal Board. And so we've chosen at this point to model that by reducing the tax collection rate to 97%. General state, please.
Howie, what about the new developments occurring in North Riverside? Costco, more restaurant development. Is that reflected in
We've
these numbers?
included those in the new construction values. One of the problems for the school district is that Costco to the school district is a big box. And it's really, even though it generates a lot of revenue from an assessment standpoint, it's primarily 4 big walls with a big open space and large number of cash registers. It certainly generates the sales tax revenue, but you have no access to it. That's always one of the problems, the difference of view of that kind of facility between the municipality and the school district.
Can you go back to the tax collection rate?
Sure.
Our budget, we've had a lot of discussions on this, is we adjust 98%. You're saying you have different or better information that we should adjust to 97%?
No, I don't have better
Well, that's
information.
what I'm trying to find out why, when we do our budget, we do 98, but you're doing a presentation that says we should do 97.
I'm not saying you should, I'm saying that's what we used as the assumption. And the only reason we did that was sort of consistent with what we had done the last 2 years, using that 97%. Last year, if I read some of the financials correctly, you didn't have nearly the number of dollars in refunds or in appeals that you had had in the previous couple years, so that's certainly one to review.
Did we combine two line items, the collection and the P-tabs into one number?
Effectively, yes.
So we came up with a slightly lower collection number because we're combining the collection and the refunds into one line item.
Yes. I'm sure if you looked at your actual collections after those refunds, you'd be far closer to 99% than 97, but trying to find a way to allow for what has consistently been a fairly big number. That's how we approached it. Next, please. So this is what the equalized assessed valuation looks like. You'll note for 2012, there was that significant drop. We had anticipated it staying relatively flat. Instead, you saw that 8.5% drop. The other impact of your EAV going down is that from the state standpoint, then, you have less property value, less wealth in the district behind each student, which would generate slightly more general state aid per student per ADA, average daily attendance, moving forward. And so as we're seeing it go back up, there's a slight inclination that it would go back down, but there is something of a concurrent but not a one-to-one relationship with student enrollment going up.
So Howie, on the EAV, I was driving in to the meeting tonight, and they said that the Cook County area property values for this year went up 11 point some percent. That's not reflected in there or anything like that, right?
No, it is not.
And if it went up 11% year over year, we wouldn't hit to see the impact until what, a year or two out?
You actually would see very little impact
Okay.
because the existing EAV, and a couple of things. First, that 11% may reflect what the county is reporting countywide, and you've sort of gone through your triennial reassessment, so the focus is going to be in other parts, I think, in the Chicago section this year. If your EAV goes up, if it goes up 11% against a CPI of 1.7%, your tax rate would drop about 9%. But you would not generate any more additional dollars from existing EAV, and in fact, you'd get fewer dollars than from any new construction.
Gotcha.
And potentially a decrease in state aid
Definitely, at some point.
because of that calculation factor.
Yeah. It would probably take about 3 years to ripple through before you'd see it, but that would be there. Next, please. And so this is the new construction estimates that we're using, the assumptions. Last year's extension had probably the lowest you've seen in many, many years. So we reduced the assumption for this year down to $1 million and then remained at $2 million, feeling again we're still in that we're still in the recovery mode, and last year was a warning that we haven't gotten there quite. Next, please. So this is what general state aid looks like, and this does take into account the projected prorations going forward. There's certainly the possibilities at the state level that they will drop the funding for general state aid, or that if in fact, particularly the pension reform, any parts of that with significant savings are found to be constitutional, there's at least a hope that some of that savings will go back into the general state aid formula, but we've tried to be relatively conservative with this. You see it spikes, that's a combination of having slightly less proration than the prior year in 2016, and your enrollment going up with the drop in EAV.
Why is the drop in 15 again, Howie?
That's the additional proration, I believe, for next year. If we could go back, we don't need to go back, I'll look at,
One more, Mary Ann.
yeah. We were projecting it to be at 85% proration for next year and beyond. And so the biggest drop in the general state aid hits next year.
Okay.
And then with enrollment going up and the EAV going down, you start to see, even at 85%, you see it come back slightly.
You made a statement, something to the effect, I believe, that there's some thought that if the pension reform is determined to be constitutional, that the state would put more fund into the general funding of schools. We had one of our state senators here, just in that same chair last year, telling us the impetus at the state is that they want to shift the cost of the pensions to the local school districts. Are you hearing something different than that?
No, not at all. I still believe, as we've said the last few years, that sitting right out there under the speaker's desk is the bill that will implement a cost shift on part of the state's obligation to the pension systems back to the local employer, like the school districts. It was not part of the pension reform legislation, but it still comes up in the speaker's language every once in a while. And I think it was kept out of the pension reform legislation so that if he chose to move forward with that, it would not be tied up in the court system while the pension reform legislation was litigated. Okay, next please. So on the expenditure side, as we talked about 75% roughly in salary and benefits, and the other portions, purchase services for some of your contracted services are included there. Next, please. The contract, as I said, if I were sitting where you are, I'd probably be patting myself on the back for successfully negotiating the contract you did. I know it was a long time in coming, but your salaries are frozen in 15, and then the base increase moving into 16 is at 85% of the consumer price index, with future years to be negotiated. So we've built those 3 years of known into the model, and then use the 85% to drive the following years. There are additional staff projected to supplement academic program at the request of the administration to model that, so you can see the impact. Health benefits, there were not only some savings in the negotiations, but some other steps you're taking, which would limit the health insurance cost to an expected 3% increase for next year, and then back to 7% in 16, sort of a little bit of down and then back up, but then 5% per year after that. Most of the remaining expenditures were increasing at the consumer price index of 2%. The other objects, which includes your tuition for students going out of the district, continues to increase in our projections at 10% per year. That's the single line item that tends to increase the largest percentage for all of our districts.
What do you base your, like, CPI? Do you go to the Department of Labor, Bureau of Labor Statistics to further estimate the CPI?
At best, it's the general consensus that with the Fed, the Federal Reserve Board, targeting the 2% growth as they're trying to manipulate money supply and economic policy, that's as good a number to use. It's less than what we've used in the past, where we were using more of an average over 10 years, 2.4, 2.5. I think taking a more conservative approach has been very, very common among our districts.
But it's got, there's some parts where it's helpful and some where it's not. If our purchase service are 15.7% and the 2% is a conservative estimate, our budget will be hurt by not addressing the fact our purchase services will be a higher rate, or our projections, right?
Well, I think if I understand correctly, by fund, we've looked at purchase services, and where
Right.
appropriate, we've increased those. But for the majority of those, they're increasing at that 2%.
Okay.
Okay.
Next, please. So enrollment projections, you are expected to see some increase in the next couple of years. And it's starting to come back down slightly. We put those together just looking at what enrollment was from your feeder districts and applying a factor of how many of those students typically come into the high school, as well as from your parochial schools. Next, please.
Can I, a question on that, does that correlate with what Tim's does for
Yes.
yours? It
Yes.
does?
Yes.
All right.
And we basically give them this data.
Okay.
Right. So this is what the certified staff looks like. You see the additional people that were modeled in 2015, that over a period of time, the other staffing would come down as the enrollment did.
So
Next.
the board's, can you stop on that one for a second, Howie? The Board of Education saw a presentation with the enrollment projections and staffing projections at about 92.3 to 93 teachers in November. I had Howie put that in at 95. So far during our staffing sessions, we've made a concentrated effort to keep all of our freshman core classes, math, science, English, and Western Civ at 25-1, following the philosophy and the data that's out there that if kids are successful in their freshman year, they'll be more successful throughout their four-year high school career. So in order to do that and to implement a few reading interventions, I had Howie schedule us at 95. I will try to keep that under 95, but you'll see that does cause us to run a little bit of a deficit, but it's directly focused and related to the goals of the district. Sorry, Howie, keep going.
Oh, that's great. Next, please. So this is looking at the historical perspective. I know questions about FY13. When we came last year using the 13 budget, you came in much better than anticipated, particularly in four areas, I think. One would be that your tax collection was higher than anticipated. Second, that the state funds, particularly because of the categoricals, provided about $225,000 of additional money that was not anticipated. The expenditures were about $200,000 to $300,000. I don't remember the exact number, less than budgeted. And then you did not make a transfer from one fund to the other that we showed below the line, if you will, last year. Next, please. So revenue projections moving forward. The majority of your funds coming from local property taxes. The other issues relatively small by comparison, but you are seeing some slight increases over the next few years in your revenues. Next, please. And the expenditures reflect the contract and salary and benefits, those changes in purchase services, looking across there, slightly higher than the 2% as we move across that board in those operating funds in the aggregate, and expenditures growing roughly at 2 to 2.5% per year.
I'm not quite sure if you answered this question when Kevin asked before, but why did you show the general state aid going up significantly in 2016? I mean, you're showing it going up by $200,000, 2016 over 2015.
One of the things that happens is it's two pieces. The first one, that in 2016, that drop in EAV will impact the local wealth for the first time. And the second is that as your enrollment goes up, we're projecting it to go up, particularly in 2015, the average daily attendance component is either the average of the last 3 years, or if prior year was the higher than the average, then using the prior year. So because you've been somewhat down, but 15 is expected to be higher, there's a jump in the ADA compared to the drop in the EAV that says you would get more dollars.
But this, you obviously can't consider, I think Sunday's Tribune had a long article about how they're considering socializing the state payment even more for districts that are paying their fair share out of their local revenue taxes. They plan to take that from them and give it to districts that aren't funding their schools locally, right?
Yeah, the report from Senator Menard's committee that's been put into bill language, I think now, certainly tries to capture a different funding mechanism for general state aid, changing the formula to reflect exactly as you said, paying more money to those districts that have less property wealth behind students and less dollars to those that have more, which would put dollars for a district like yours in jeopardy if it were to be passed. The consensus is it's a well thought out plan, but well thought out plans don't necessarily translate to actual passage of a bill when there seems to be opposition in the House. So when we bring the two of those revenue and expenditures together, as Kevin said, the projections at this point in the year point to a small deficit for next year that stays relatively consistent over those few years. It gives you something to think about as you're putting a budget together, making sure that everything matches both the academic and the financial plans. But it's a considerably better picture than what we've had the last couple of years, in no small part because of the contract. Being able to capture a contract that you can sustain with CPI. And so looking ahead, you see that line which aggregates the fund balances by those funds across the years is now looking relatively flat. Much better picture than what we see in most of our districts, and much better than what we've shown in the past. In fact, the next one is looking at what we had projected a year ago, back in December of 12. You can see how the line has flattened out and is at a higher level. Next, please. And then at the request of the administration, we also superimposed a line that would show board direction of what would 20% of expenditures be to have cash on hand, higher than that, and through 2019 you still are in that mode. Financial profile scores are in the recognition category now. They look like they might drop slightly to the next lower one, but you're right on that border, and it's really a matter of simply having a deficit drives that down. Any other questions I can answer?
I know there were a few sent in, but I think you might have answered them throughout the presentation from Mr. Walsh. I don't know if we missed any, Tim. Feel good?
I tried to be sure I hit most, as many of those as I
So
could.
how we have a one-time infusion of $8.9 million.
Yes.
What have you seen other schools do with that money very wisely? What kind of direction or, recommendations would you make sure that should be looking at the following?
The advantage that you have now is that you've finished the project, and so those funds are in effect a free and clear grant to the district because you've paid for the projects with the building out of tax revenues. So you can do absolutely anything from more building improvements to one-time expenditures to abating taxes to probably the least, well, the other one is to support ongoing operations a little bit at a time. But like everything else, you can only spend them once, so it's a matter of how do you get the most, and when you've determined what the goals are and prioritizing those. I'm not sure that there's a great answer for your district in comparison to others without a lot of input from you.
Pension coming back to us. If you're a betting man, what would you take?
It's going to happen. In my mind, the pension reform, as I said, did not include the cost shift, so that it wasn't tied up in the court, and maintain a bargaining chip and a club that the speaker could hold over everybody's head, particularly as it applies to Chicago. And the crisis that was at the state level last year with pension funds has shifted focus to Chicago's issues with all of their employees and their teachers union. I think it's the bargaining tool, but ultimately, if any part of the pension legislation is not approved, is not held to be constitutional, and the savings that are implied from those parts are not realized, that will be used to fill the gap. I think that it will be there if the conversation about extending the income tax stalls, and this $1.5 billion to $2 billion hole that appears in the FY15 budget is that cutting that much money is too undesirable, then it becomes a chip in the game to offset some of that. And as school districts complain that we're not getting the money we want, then we may get the money on one side and yet have it taken away on the other. It's going to happen in my mind.
Any questions for Howie?
I wanted to ask you one other question, if you know what goes to the suggestions people have for this real estate issue and shifting the cost. I see a lot of discussion about, basing it on the equalized value within the district, but what never gets touched on whether there's some minimal requirement for, it's a school district to charge some rate based on that, like the city of Chicago. They never raise their property taxes because they know the money's going to come from the state. So is there any discussion, to say, okay, there's two pieces. One is what the value is, what you could base it on. The other one is taking some percentage of that value, and if you don't take that from your local property taxes, you don't get it from the state.
There are some minimums of effort that every district has to meet, and if they don't, they do potentially lose general state aid. They ultimately end up taking the equalized assessed value after the multiplier that, Cook County has a huge multiplier by comparison to everybody else. And then one of the pieces in the upcoming potential legislation, in the formula, it uses as a measure of effort, to your point, a standard tax rate for elementary districts, a standard rate for high school districts, and a standard rate for unit districts. And one of the points was to use the same measure for all three types of districts, which probably helps a high school district more than either of the other two, as I'm reading what I think the legislation is going to say.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Howie?
I just want to kind of put what you're doing in perspective. When you come and, meet with the business manager, you have 40 or more variables for each year. And when you're doing a 5+ year plan, you're juggling in excess of 200 to 300 variables for just our school alone. that when you crunch the numbers out and project them out, and every day something could change, and you could run our projections again. You know, we bought your services through a contract, and we still have time remaining, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I think we're in a good position to look at these numbers and the 200 to 300 variables that go in, and anytime something changes, we can get numbers in a short turnaround if the board wants. And you know, when we meet with the Finance Advisory Committee, a lot of the groundwork is already done between yourself, Kevin, and the business manager, and we come in, and maybe Gary would give a little highlight or insight as to how the contract would move numbers forward going out, and we just kind of tweak those variables until we get a presentation to bring to the board just to see where our finances are going. And I appreciate the hard work, and I like the way that the line is higher and the line is less steep. And I just wanted to put that in perspective for people who are trying to grasp what really you do. It's really a cumbersome thing.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask Mike a follow-up question, or Gary. As you've explained it, what numbers would trigger a new event? What numbers would people want to be cognizant of? Would it be a reassessment? Would it be, I don't know, some major incident,
Big spike in insurance.
insurance? What
I
would?
think
What
the
would be-
revenue side is pretty well, you're not gonna have major dollar variances with the revenue, because we're so dependent on property taxes. So even at EAV, you're gonna have some impact on state, but we don't know where the state percentages are gonna wind up. So I think if our projections on the expenditure side are way out of line, then I think we need to come back. Our biggest thing is the salary and benefits. So that's why this has changed so much from the previous president, because now we have a clear picture of at least the next 3 years. We're making assumptions on those following 3 years. But, you know, what other expenditures do we have out there? As Tim said, purchases, services, are they gonna go up 20% a year, 1 year, and then they're gonna go up 5%? Are they gonna go up? So we have to make certain projections. If we get clarity, then these should probably be recasted out, you know. If all of a sudden, in the next 6 months, we get dumped on us the pension costs, which is a big thing,
Yeah.
then I think it's something we need to be evaluated, and we need to make sure our state senator comes back here so that we can talk to him and tell him how it can't be affordable.
Yeah.
So,
And like, we don't know what insurance costs are gonna be. Each year, the pool
Right,
we're in will tell us.
right, we have some clarity of next year's health insurance costs, but we're making projections on the following 2 years and years out, but those could be significantly different.
And if you take the budget, 75% of salary and benefits and 15% of purchase services, you know, our contractual obligations is 90% of our budget. And as students go up, then we have an impact of teachers. As students goes down, we may not need so many teachers. The cost of everything, whether it fluctuates up or down, and except for how we budget for the potential give back of the real estate taxes, the income side of the equation is pretty tight and locked
Yeah,
down.
see, that's the unfortunate thing. I mean, I think we're getting reimbursed under $1,000 per student from the state. But yet our property, so if we bring in 100 more students, our property taxes aren't gonna go up for the 11,000 that we're paying per pupil to educate them. We're only getting under $1,000 from the state to supposedly fund those additional students. The other districts, the city of Chicago gets over $4,000 a student. Yeah, but we, so, I mean, that's the kind of stuff we're up against.
And the current thought is to socialize it even more.
Yeah.
Take more money from the districts that are funding successfully like we are and send it to the districts that are choosing not to do that.
Well, that has always been the argument when all the school boards come together at the annual meeting. Their greatest fear is the city of Chicago, which has over 100,000 students, that it would never be a fair equation. All the money would go into the city, and the rest of the state, particularly downstate Illinois, wouldn't see any money for
Well,
that.
no, it's because it's because the city of Chicago chooses not to raise their property taxes for education. There's a standard formula per number of students being educated times a rate. Cutting off, minus off, as how we said, this property tax divided by. So if you choose not to, create this, and I don't know if TIFs get subtracted off of that. So, and the city of Chicago is going crazy with their TIFs. So their EAVs are staying low, yet so their percentage, they're getting 4,000 plus or whatever the number is. I don't know what the latest number is per student. What Tim's saying is, let's socialize it more. So since we are perceived to be a wealthy district, let's cut that less than 1,000 per pupil, even less, and give it to those whose EAV are perceived not to be big.
And it's not just the city either. If you read
Right,
the
there's
article on the
other-
trip, almost all of the top districts in EAV are in the Cook County suburbs. So it's also the southern Illinois, East St. Louis area. A lot of those school districts have low EAV per student there. And so the thought is you take the people with the high EAV and just give them less money
Fend
because
for
their
themselves.
property's worth more.
All right,
So you're moving the funding and helping out the rest of the state.
So as a school board, do we have, we belong to an association, should we be asking for greater lobbying against that in the state of Illinois in our legislature?
Well, I think the School Board Association and Superintendent's Association is lobbying against that. What's tough with that is the same School Board Association we belong to, so does the Southern Illinois schools, who are having trouble paying their bills. So they're lobbying for more help, so it's kind of how good you get with your local legislatures and.
This is a big battle, though, that probably will not be resolved.
No,
Very soon.
nothing.
But, so our community members, though, could write their representatives maybe and tell them that they feel their tax burden, that they're paying a significant amount of property tax to fund their school, and they don't want to see that diminished.
All right, any other questions for Howie? Howie?
So we have a nice set of numbers to move forward.
Johnny has a question.
John?
Yes, please.
I don't know a lot about this, but it seems to me there should be some error bars on this or some range of probable scenarios. How come you guys don't do that?
It's one of those that we do once we've established the base model, or at the request of the district, the administration, we can easily do that. It's, as I think, as Mike was talking, it's something that can occur almost instantaneously when you focus in on the assumptions that you want to see changed. What happens if general state aid were reduced to, and instead of you getting $1,000 per student, you suddenly found yourself under a new formula where you got $218 per student, as the richest districts get, and the impact that would have on losing hundreds of thousands of dollars. Or the impact of the shift in the pension. We're often modeling what would occur if that obligation began to go up at 0.5% per year. And it's just, when do you want it to kick in, FY15 or FY16? But with your salary structure, with salaries, period, for anybody, that's a pretty significant amount of dollars to go up, because it just compounds. It's 0.5%, then 1%, 2%, 4%.
Okay, any other questions for Howie? Howie, thanks a lot, great presentation again, appreciate it.
Thank you, Howie.
Thank you very much.
Tim?
All right.